Today's topic is Graham versus Connor, what objective reasonableness means, and how body cameras can impact the objective reasonableness analysis in a use of force. I'm Steve Serbalik, and I'm a panel attorney with ASCOPS in Arizona. This week's video finishes up the series on Graham versus Connor analysis. So if you missed them before watching this video, check out the other videos in this series that talked about the Graham versus Connor elements and what you need to do to articulate your use of force. Now that that's covered, today I'll talk about the difference between objective and subjective review, how courts determine whether a use of force is objectively reasonable, and why, in my opinion, allowing an officer or his or her representation to view body camera footage before an interview will best allow the officer to articulate why a use of force was objectively reasonable. As always, please keep in mind that this is a general topic overview, not legal advice. So if you have questions about a specific incident, ask for help. So first, let's talk about the difference between objective and subjective analysis. So I'll start with what a subjective analysis is. It's an opinion based upon a personal preference. For example, someone's favorite color or their favorite movie involves subjective opinions. And in a use of force case, a subjective factor is whether the officer intended to behave in an immoral way or whether the officer believed that what he or she was doing was right. On the other hand, objective analysis involves standards that are not opinions, but involve articulable facts and actions. This brings us to how courts determine whether a use of force is objectively reasonable. Graham versus Connor makes it clear that the officer's subjective intent is not the proper standard to use, and instead, courts use objective facts that a reasonable officer on the scene would consider, and apply a totality of the circumstance test based upon these specific articulable facts to determine if a use of force is legally justified. So now that we've covered the difference between subjective and objective analysis and how courts look at the perspective of the officer on the scene and not with 20/20 hindsight, let's talk about why officers or their representation should watch body camera footage prior to an interview. In evaluating an officer's articulation of his or her use of force, courts will analyze whether the officer's actions are consistent with what an objectively reasonable officer on the scene would do based upon the totality of the circumstances. Which means the evaluation of an officer's conduct is based upon what a reasonable officer would have known at the scene, not simply what the involved officer actually knew. So let me give an extreme example of how this could be important. Let's say that there was an officer who decided to close his eyes and fire in the general direction of a suspect. The officer, with his eyes closed, didn't see a suspect drop the gun and raise his hands above his head. But deliberately choosing not to see what was going on would be viewed as objectively unreasonable. And the fact that the officer didn't see a suspect surrender would be unreasonable. When it comes to body cameras, the danger is that an officer's decision-making may involve different factors than what is shown on the video. For example, the video may show a suspect action that occurred while the officer was looking in a different direction. But looking away might not be unreasonable, and giving the officer the opportunity to explain why his or her decision-making was different than what is shown on the video could be critical. On the other hand, if an officer gives a statement that quote-unquote contradicts the video, the officer might be viewed as untruthful and is forced to make a terrible decision, whether to change or contradict a statement after seeing the video and looking like he or she changed the story to address a video. And officers being labeled untruthful, even if there's a valid explanation after the fact, may never recover in the eyes of the public. So showing a body camera video to an officer or the officer's representation prior to a statement avoids contradiction and is consistent with the officer articulating objective reasonableness as required by Graham versus Connor. These are complicated factors that should be weighed by experts. So if you are involved in a significant use of force, ask for help. Lawyers like me and organizations like ASCOPS are here to help. Just give us a call. I'm Steve Serbalik. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.